Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
I wanted to start this week off by talking about this recent ban on foreign-made routers. So this just happened a few weeks ago, and when I first saw it, I thought it was pretty big news. So it's a little bit old, but still fairly recent. So it was March 23rd of this year. The FCC announced that it would ban all new consumer-grade routers manufactured abroad for quote-unquote national security reasons. And so applying that to all hardware made in foreign countries, regardless of the manufacturer's nationality. So it's pretty much anything that's made outside of the US. The FCC updated its covered list, which previously used to target specific companies like Huawei and ZTE, and expanded it to include an entire category of household internet equipment based solely on foreign origin. The FCC defines produced in a foreign country broadly as any stage of manufacturing outside of the U.S. counts, including manufacturing, assembling, design, and development. So the nationality of the company is irrelevant. And the ban also followed a determination by the White House convened interagency body that foreign-produced routers pose unacceptable risks by introducing supply chain vulnerabilities and severe cybersecurity risks. The FCC cited Volt, Flax, and Salt Typhoon attacks, Chinese state-sponsored campaigns that exploited vulnerabilities in foreign-made routers to target U.S. infrastructure as direct justification. So this is significant in many reasons. Number one, there's hardly any consumer-grade routers that are manufactured entirely in the U.S. There are some enterprise equipment from like companies like Cisco that has domestic production, but most affordable consumer options do not exist. So if you look at all of the, produced in a foreign country, their stages, manufacturing, assembling, design, and development, there's probably I don't think there's a single router that might be consumer grade that's like fully manufactured, assembled, designed, and developed all in the United States. Even brands, like American brands like Netgear or Eero, are not exempt since they're American companies, but the products themselves are manufactured overseas.
Mm-hmm.
All existing consumer grade Wi-Fi 7 routers are made abroad, and none of them are affected by the ban today. But going forward, new routers supporting the upcoming standards like Wi-Fi 8 will need to be manufactured in the US or be granted a conditional approval. A lot of critics are arguing that the ban may actually worsen security by banning the newest, most secure router because it forces consumers to keep older and more vulnerable devices longer, also increasing the total attack surface rather than reducing it. And there's a lot of analysts who are expecting new domestic manufacturing to emerge over the next 12 to 18 months. But in the interim, there is a real gap right now. So the most important thing to know is that the ban doesn't apply retroactively. So consumers can continue to use routers that they already own, and retailers may continue to sell existing inventory until, they run out, and everything that's already been imported is fine to sell. The FCC will allow continued software and firmware updates for those existing approved routers through March 1st of 2027, but then limit to updates that mitigate security risks or maintain device functionality only. Starting in September of 2026, this year, retailers are prohibited from importing new inventory of covered devices. Smartphones with hotspot capabilities are not considered routers under this determination, even though they can function as network access points. There is an exception/conditional approval process. The Department of War or the Department of Homeland Security can grant a conditional approval for specific routers or class of routers that are found to not pose unacceptable risks, and applications are submitted to conditional-approval at fcc.gov. So, apparently the approval process, it will require extensive disclosure, including U.S. manufacturing or onshoring plans, and approval is not guaranteed. So it's granted for limited periods, up to 18 months. And right now, as of the ban's effective date, no consumer networking equipment has yet received conditional approval. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions surrounding company audits, exceptions, how the software updates will work to existing routers, and how that will impact long term beyond that March 2027 deadline. The FCC did take kind of a similar action recently in December of 2025 by banning new foreign produced drones and drone components. DJI, I think, is that major drone company, and they're a Chinese company. And so that has affected the drone industry for sure. Like, no new DJI drones have been imported. There's like brand new ones that are out there that are being sold elsewhere that are not in the United States. So, but they did grant some exceptions for specific models. So there is that pathway and kind of proven history of that conditional approval pathway, maybe some way to do that for routers as well. So fairly big news. That kind of, for me, I think it kind of slipped under the wire. And it's going to affect a lot of like just like what we call muggles, right? Like people just go to the store and buy routers they don't really know. And I think this is going to be it's going to have some implications down the line for sure.
So we should clarify the FCC is the Federal Communications Commission, and they regulate effectively the nation's radio waves. Anything that transmits a radio signal, potentially transmits a radio signal, is subject to their jurisdiction. And so, very specifically, like an Ethernet switch is not subject really to the FCC. Yeah, there is kind of an FCC approval process for basically any electronic device, but where they really have the hammer to wave is with radio devices, like a Wi-Fi router in particular, as opposed to a hardwired switch. That's where they really have the control. And this is a natural extension of the ongoing efforts of the current United States presidential administration to try to generate more onshoring, to bring manufacturing back to the United States, to put the toothpaste back in the tube. You don't have to study a lot of the geopolitical nature of the world today to understand the risks with current manufacturing. And you don't have to go far back. The COVID pandemic was a perfect example of how, in extreme circumstances or emergencies, countries will emphasize their own people's good before sharing with others. The United States, in particular, bought up a lot of vaccine supply from American vaccine makers like Pfizer. And oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the one. Moderna, thank you. Before those could be shared with the rest of the world. And of course, there were all sorts of shortages with different products that were Chinese manufactured, and China was prioritizing themselves, especially things related to like PPE, various health and medical equipment, a lot of which was manufactured in China, they kept for themselves. And so I get like there's a big picture here on we need to control more of our own destiny from a United States perspective. At the same time, I think all of the objections here are very realistic. Number one, the one that stands out to me is restricting new software updates after March 1st.
Mm-hmm.
That like reeks of someone who has never dealt with a technical person a day in their life, because the fact that my Wi-Fi router is no longer getting software updates, first off, most people don't even know if they are or aren't. Hopefully they are getting automatic updates, but they probably don't know. If it stops getting automatic updates, there's no like signal to that. There's no flashing red light that says, hey, your TP-Link router is now unpatched because it hasn't gotten an update in 6 months. There's no warning to that. And so that it's not a theoretical, I can say it with an absolute certainty, it will hurt security of consumer Wi-Fi networks in this country if most of them stop receiving software updates past March of next year. I mean, if I was someone, go war driving next April, a year from now, and you're going to have a lot of success when there's all sorts of unpatched vulnerabilities and every single Wi-Fi device that is in production in the United States today. You mean we are going to switch over every consumer Wi-Fi device in this country in 13 months? Like, for real? Like, you're out of your mind. That's not going to happen. That's crazy talk. So why would you stop allowing them to be updated if you're concerned about security updates? That doesn't make any sense, and it's not realistic. What this really is is it's the FCC leveraging the leverage they have over the nation's radio waves to basically make every single Wi-Fi manufacturer show up and ask for the exception. And then they're now eating out of the palm of their hand on, please give us an exception. Here's our onshoring plans. We plan to build manufacturing facilities in 3, 4, 5, 6 years, whatever it is. Okay, fine. Now, a lot of them, they may try to kick the can down the road and hope a more favorable administration comes in 3 years or less now, and they don't ever have to actually do this. And the smart ones will play this sort of game. Apple has really not made any real commitment to move iPhone manufacturing at any great scale to the United States, but they have presented members of the administration with gifts, and they have done these big showy events where they're talking about all this investment they've made in the United States, and they're building very low volume devices like the Mac Studio, or it was the Mac Pro before it, in the United States. And those are literally a fraction of a single percent of how many iPhones are built. And that's been the golden goose, is we want iPhones built in the United States, which go read the book Apple in China, which I've plugged on the show many times if you want to understand how difficult that would be to have happen. So a lot of these organizations are going to do the bare minimum here to get the exemptions and keep moving forward. And you may see favoritism played to American-based companies. I mean, Eero may have more success if Jeff Bezos has been throwing money at the administration or whatever. There's pay for play potentially going on here. And it's, from a cybersecurity perspective, I'm not convinced this makes us more secure. I think this is really to try to drive more manufacturing in the United States, and it's using a leverage point they have. Someone pointed out, hey, we approve every Wi-Fi router that gets sold in this country. Aha, we can stop approving them unless they do what we want. And that's really what's going on here. I don't think it's a cybersecurity thing. I think it's a manufacturing and in the United States and jobs kind of thing. And then the administration gets to tout wins on how much manufacturing they moved to the shores of the United States, which that's such a multi-year process to do, to move all of this. Because if any stage is overseas, then you are subject to this ban. Most people don't have a concept of how much manufacturing moves around overseas. It doesn't all happen in one place. The packaging may be printed here, the chips are built here, and then they're shipped there, and these other subcomponents are made here, and they're all brought together. And to bring every single aspect of that onshore within the timeline of this administration is not realistic. And so what most companies will do is instead of just, they didn't get this memo and said, you're right, well, let's move everything to the United States now. Go, go, go. Project Warp Speed. That's not what they're doing. I assure you that's not what they're doing. They are finding out the bare minimum way they can bribe and cajole the administration to allow them to keep doing what they're doing, or make token efforts to move some portion of manufacturing onshore, host the president and some of his people, give him a present, and get the approval that way. This is really not a cybersecurity thing from my mind. Now, are there legitimate cybersecurity risks? Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm not diminishing that. And I think we've even talked on this show how there's been guidance from CISA and other people to stop using things like TP-Link routers. Even our employer has suggested that would be a good idea, is to not use certain brands of routers. I mean, there has been a conversation about it. So it's not that this is a complete,
the threat's real,
nothing burger.
Yeah.
But I do think this is more through the lens of how can we force and bend organizations to move more manufacturing to the United States. And in cybersecurity is kind of the excuse for it. Kind of like a lot of these layoffs saying it's AI when it's really not.
Yeah.
It kind of feels that way to me.
It's interesting because I remember reading about this whole manufacturing conundrum, because even if they were to bring, let's say they were able to bring an entire router, right, manufacturing process here to the United States, the cost of that router would be much more expensive than a foreign made router. And so, we live in a capitalist society. So and I remember when I was researching kind of manufacturing in general, I came across a story of a company based out in the Northeast that was manufacturing shower heads. And they used to manufacture every single thing in that shower head, right? Like the screws and the pipes and the widgets and everything that went in there. And they were there were people shops around that would machine all of that out. And then slowly and surely, like those machined parts went overseas, so they had to buy them and import a lot of them, but they still assembled it in the United States. And then they actually like put out a like a survey, and they said, "Hey, we're putting these together. It's assembled in the United States. Would you pay, 30%, 50% more for this shower head versus this one that looks exactly the same, functions exactly the same, but is much cheaper? So like, would you pay $300 for a US made shower head versus like $80 for one made in China?" And 100% of the people who responded to this survey picked the cheaper option. So, like if you were to say this router is made in America and this one is made somewhere else, wherever, assembled in Taiwan, um, would you pay for, $300 for this router versus, $80 for this router? I bet the majority of people would almost without fail pick the cheaper option, right?
It is it absolutely, yes. And I will say, um, look, I have tons of stuff that was made in China or other countries in East Asia, that is absolutely best in its class. It's the best at whatever product it's supposed to be. So this statement is not denigrating the manufacturing capabilities. They're truly incredible, and are the envy of the world. So that's not this statement. However, with my family, I have a number of people in my family that are extreme right wing patriots, if you will. And they are the most guiltiest of buying the like cheapest, crappiest, most garbagey stuff off of Amazon, from these brand names where it looks like someone mashed their fist on the keyboard to come up with the brand name. And it tends to be Chinese in nature. And again, this isn't saying Chinese manufacturing is bad. They make amazing things, but they do make cheap things too. And these patriots are like, they're the biggest consumers of it. Whereas even I've kind of reached a point where I will really go around and look for what's the highest quality thing in this category? What's not just the cheapest or the fastest I can get shipped to me on Amazon, but is there a small business here? Is there someone I can support? Is there an American made one I can support? And I am willing to pay more. But it's ironic to me that sometimes what people say they will do and what they actually do are very different. And that's obviously, we can give a million examples of that throughout our lives. People very commonly say one thing and do another. But to your point, capitalism, baby. I mean, people are price conscientious. And if it's the same thing and this one costs 30% less, why would I pay 30% more? Well, maybe I do want to support a small business. Maybe I do want to support American manufacturing. I actually do. I do that sometimes, not all the time, when there is a clear difference, and it's worth investing there. But a lot of times I've gotten some great stuff and I can't believe how inexpensive it is. It's truly unbelievable. It's like, this is an amazing high quality item and it's so inexpensive.
Yeah.
It's amazing, so anyhow, it's
Something to keep an eye on, I think, in the next few months. Definitely do not let this kind of just go off into the news ether, right?
Well, I kept laughing when you were talking about like this happened 3 weeks ago and it's already gotten buried because, there's been plenty of news in the world and it's kind of amazing because it's a big deal and it will be really impactful if it comes to fruition the way it is. I would anticipate lawsuits. This could be the FCC, and I am not a constitutional scholar or a governmental scholar, but it could be them overstepping the bounds of what their mandate is. They may not have a mandate for cybersecurity. They just have a mandate to ensure the, clear usage of the radio waves and fairness and all those things. I mean, this is the same FCC, by the way, that pretty much has consistently threatened to pull licenses of broadcasters if they broadcast unflattering coverage of the president as well. So this FCC is certainly not afraid to paint outside the lines on their mandate and what their purpose is for the American people, and to leverage that more strongly than maybe it was intended. So I think stay tuned here. I have my doubts that this will come to fruition exactly as described here, but we'll see.
All right. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is Claude Mythos. And before we get into Claude Mythos and what it is, let's do our standard disclaimer because we are going to be talking a little bit about our employer, Microsoft.
Yeah, Microsoft is definitely part of the Claude Mythos story. So Andy and I do both work for Microsoft. We work in our field security sales. We do the show outside of work on our own time. As we record this, it's Sunday evening at about 7:30 p.m. local time. And we self-fund the show. We do not take advertisements, and we make no money off the show. So it's truly a labor of love and our own investment. So the opinions and thoughts you're going to hear expressed and have heard expressed and shared are those of Adam Brewer and Andy Jaw, and do not necessarily represent those of Microsoft Corporation. And with that, let's talk Claude Mythos.
Okay. So I know we have been talking a lot about Anthropic, but they have been doing a lot of great work and they've been in the news. And
They
so
sure have.
this week they dropped another bomb in like kind of the AI world. And this one's kind of more specific to cybersecurity, but they released Claude Mythos. And so let's first define what it is. And so Claude Mythos is a general purpose, it's actually general purpose, unreleased frontier model from Anthropic that has reached a level of coding capability where it can surpass all but the most skilled humans at finding and exploiting software vulnerabilities. So the LLM was not specifically trained for cybersecurity, but it did improve its cyber capabilities as a result of strong coding and reasoning skills. And so these capabilities emerge as downstream consequences of just general improvements in code and reasoning and autonomy. And the same improvements that made it better at patching vulnerabilities also makes it better at exploiting them. So why is this significant? Well, it has already found thousands of high severity vulnerabilities, including some in every major operating system and web browser. And it's a massive leap in evolution over the prior models. Opus 4.6 produced working Firefox JS engine exploits only 2 times out of the several hundred attempts, whereas Mythos produced 181 working exploits on the same benchmark. So, you know, pretty significant leap in capabilities. On internal benchmarks across 7,000 open source entry points, Sonnet 4.6 and Opus 4.6, both of those are Anthropic LLMs, each has achieved only a single crash at tier 3, whereas Mythos achieved 595 crashes at tier 1 and 2, several at tier 3 and 4, and a fully controlled flow hijack on tier 5 on 10 separate, fully patched targets. Anthropic has also privately warned top government officials that Mythos makes large-scale cyber attacks significantly more likely this year, and it also described it as simultaneously their best aligned and most aligned risky model ever built. So I'll pause there. Adam, what are your thoughts on all of this so far?
A little background here. There has been a certain group of people involved in AI development who have definitely been more on the chicken little sounds derisive. They're very concerned about safety. Let's put it that way. OpenAI was originally founded as a nonprofit, as many people know. And the pitch to many of these researchers, almost all of whom the best researchers in the world, they all work for Google DeepMind. I mean, that was the who's who of AI scholars. And the way OpenAI hired some of them away from Google DeepMind as a nonprofit that could not pay the kind of salaries Google was paying was by promising that they were going to be safety first. Because there was always the fear eventually this would get productized and Google would go really fast and unleash this on the world too quickly. One of the early employees at OpenAI in its nonprofit safety focused days was Dario Amodei. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he's CEO of Anthropic today. And so it is curious that Anthropic recently was in the news for no longer allowing OpenClaw without a subscription, like a pay-as-you-go subscription even. Even if you had a paid subscription, you had to pay more, and has been taking things out of the free tier because it's been so popular, but they are just very compute constrained. And Dario Amodei has been very open about how conservative they've been with their compute build out. They are very, very conservative with it. So it is very interesting that Anthropic announces a new model, happens to be extremely compute constrained, and says, oh, but you can't have this. And they claim it's completely for safety reasons. It's not safe enough. This is too dangerous. This could, find too many exploits. We can't release this yet. Don't forget they are capacity constrained as well, to like an extreme degree to where they're pulling a lot back right now. That is important context. The other thing is Dario Amodei has always been very much on the constantly, the sky is falling, AI will be the end of days, it will kill us all, Skynet will be, self-aware on October 1997 and blah blah blah, launch the Terminator, this and that. Like he's definitely in that side of things. So all of this is very on brand for Anthropic is what I'm saying. So at the same time, like this is real. I don't think they're making this up. I'm not calling them a liar. I am saying, however, it's a very interesting strategy to be like, hey, we came up with a new model and it's so amazing and you all can't have it. And it's because it's too dangerous for you to have it. This could blow up the world kind of thing. That's interesting. And when you contextualize it all with their leader has always been like extremely safety concerned, like one of the AI doomers, like borderline that, and their capacity constraints. That's important context. So I just want to point that out. What's interesting, and we haven't gotten to the part here yet, is the Microsoft Security Research Center has been one of the teams that's gotten access to this and reported some interesting findings too. Maybe not as blockbuster findings as what you just shared, but certainly some interesting findings as well. And I know we're going to get into more of some of what the notable vulnerabilities are, but I do like to set that context before we get further into it, because to your point, Anthropic's been in the news a lot right now, and I've really been learning more about this organization. There was that, like, what was it, 16,000 word piece in the New Yorker about Sam Altman that dropped earlier this week. If you haven't read that, it's incredible. Dario Amodei is a frequent subject in that, so that's also worth your time. There's just been a lot about this right now, and it's top of mind for everyone. So this is really, really interesting, and I'm excited to dig into this topic a little more, but I did want to set some of the context there before we continue.
Yeah, and like one of the fun stories as that I read as they were testing Claude Mythos, they actually put it into a sandbox and then told it to try to break out, and it actually did. And it, like, apparently the researcher who was like kind of overseeing that whole thing was eating a sandwich on a bench or something like that in a park, and Claude Mythos sent him an email. And it was like, "Hey, I broke out." That's a fun little fun fact, I guess. So a little bit on the technical details of how Cloud Mythos works. It runs inside of an isolated container with the target code base and the source code. So you have to kind of um, give it the code that you want it to like look at. And it's essentially invoked just by saying something like find a security vulnerability in this program. It then reads the code, hypothesizes vulnerabilities, and then runs the actual project to confirm or reject its suspicions. It adds debug logic, it adds debuggers as needed, and outputs either a null result or a full bug report with a proof of concept, exploit, and reproduction steps. That's so crazy. And then it can also chain together 3, 4, sometimes 5 vulnerabilities in a sequence and produce a sophisticated end outcome, something no single vulnerability would achieve independently. And there's already been real world findings that Cloud Mythos has done. So like there was, for example, a 27-year-old vulnerability in OpenBSD, which allowed any attacker to remotely crash any machine simply by running it to simply by connecting to it. There was another 16-year-old vulnerability in FFmpeg in a line of code that automated testing tools had hit 5 million times without catching the problem. And then another 17-year-old RCE remote code execution vulnerability in FreeBSD's NFS server, granting full root access to unauthenticated users, found and exploited fully autonomously only after the initial prompt, like we talked about here. There was a web browser exploit chaining 4 vulnerabilities together via a just-in-time heap spray, escaping both rendering and OS sandboxes. And then local privilege escalation on Linux, exploiting subtle race conditions and case log bypasses fully autonomously. So significant real world, like some vulnerabilities that have been around a long time. People have looked at this code, they haven't found it, and Claude Mythos was able to do that. Over 99% of the vulnerabilities found have not yet been patched. So making full disclosure is irresponsible at this time per coordinated vulnerability disclosure processes. So pretty cool stuff.
Pretty incredible. Absolutely.
So at the same time, Anthropic announced something called Project Glasswing. And so Project Glasswing kind of goes hand in hand with Claude Mythos because, like Adam said, they were thinking that this new model was too dangerous to release to the public. So they announced something called Project Glasswing, which is a defensive cybersecurity initiative. And it brings together a lot of companies like AWS, Apple, Broadcom, Cisco, CrowdStrike, Google, JP Morgan and Chase, the Linux Foundation, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Palo Alto Networks, so on and so forth. There's over 40 additional organizations that are building or maintaining critical software infrastructure that have access to both scan first party and open source systems. Anthropic is committing up to $100 million in usage credits and $4 million in direct donations to open source security organizations. Named after the quote unquote glasswing butterfly, whose transparent wings let it hide in plain sight, a metaphor for making software vulnerabilities visible. Claude Mythos preview is available to the participants through the Claude AI API, Amazon Bedrock, Google Cloud Vertex AI, and Microsoft Foundry. So pretty cool. There's all these companies they're going to have access to it to use it. And for our employer, Microsoft, they're enabling research preview access to Claude Mythos for Azure customers who are part of Project Glasswing. So you have to be part of those organizations through the Microsoft Foundry, and then also giving customers a unified platform for building and deploying, governing those AI systems at scale. Microsoft has evaluated Mythos using CTI Realm, which is Microsoft's own open source benchmark for AI agents on real world detection engineering tasks, and it has shown substantial improvements over the prior models. Microsoft views this as moving into a phase where cybersecurity is no longer bound by human capacity, and it sees AI accelerated vulnerability discovery as a key to reducing the attack surfaces adversaries depend. And so, like we said, Anthropic does have this main concern that, it could be used by the attackers as well as defenders, right? So they're thinking that because Mythos has all these capabilities, attackers may, if they had access to this model, their cybersecurity attacks would be way too fast or too sophisticated for most of the defenders to block. Anthropic is maintaining this mountaineering analogy where a skilled guide increases risk for a client precisely because they make their clients climb higher and on more dangerous ground. So the plan right now is Anthropic doesn't want to release Mythos preview generally available for the public, but eventually they want to safely deploy it in Mythos class models at scale once new safeguards are in place. And so the plan is to develop and test those safeguards on upcoming Claude Opus models first before any broader rollout of Mythos class capabilities. So, just for folks who are going to be testing it on, and I think that a lot of these 40 companies or more that are part of Project Glasswing are going to really be able to test it and run it through its paces and find some vulnerabilities that normally humans have not been able to.
Yeah, these vulnerabilities that Mythos found, the way they were described to me was they would require a level of tenacity that humans are just almost incapable of, where the diligence and willingness to just systematically test everything is just obviously very inhuman. They don't need breaks, it doesn't need naps, it doesn't need sleep. It can just constantly hammer on everything. And, we used to talk about how open source software was not necessarily more secure because there weren't people walking around doing security reviews out of the goodness of their hearts, right? Security researchers need to pay their mortgage too. And my hypothesis is they would focus on areas where there is a bug bounty program where they can get paid. And so, actually, a lot of commercial software through companies that can afford robust bug bounty programs may actually have better security because they invest in and encourage security research to be done on their products. Whereas open source projects, someone's not going around to this component that's widely used in every software in the world because no one's going to pay them to do it. Now, your hope is just naturally someone's looking at the code and goes, aha, look at this. Well, theoretically, this could get worse now with Mythos, because if I can point it at the source code and say, find a vulnerability in this, open source is actually more dangerous than, say, a product like a commercial software that the source code is not going to be accessible. I'm only going to be able to test it based on the compiled executable code. And so that's a different amount of attack surface. So it could actually get worse before it gets better. Now, hopefully people do start investing in basically like donating AI tokens to go scan all the code repositories of the world and help secure all the open source code out there. And hopefully that becomes part of this too. It's interesting that where we're starting is I saw the Linux Foundation was on here and I think was, let me go up to your list here. Was Mozilla included? I didn't see them.
Mozilla isn't on
I bet
the
they
notes
are,
here,
though.
but I'm sure they are
There's the over
included.
40 additional organizations part. Maybe they roll up
Yeah.
in there. But a lot of these are big commercial software, closed source software, and they're getting the first run at this. And I'd almost say in some ways they don't need it as much as all the open source software of the world. So this is, I get what they're doing, right? This is basically, hey, Microsoft, take this, run it against the Windows code base, go patch the obvious stuff before we ever release this to the world. And hey, Apple, go do the same thing for Mac OS, iOS, iPad OS, etc., so on and so forth. That's a good idea. I like that. I support that. And some of these exploits, I mean, like crash any OpenBSD system just by connecting to it, and it's been there for 25 plus years is incredible. You notice that the Microsoft Security Research Center didn't claim some of these kind of, I wouldn't say outlandish claims, but it wasn't like it's 90 times better. They're like, yeah, it was pretty impressive. It was more kind of what their post said, and we're definitely evaluating it, and it's a concern. This is cool. I mean, this is, you look at how could this be used for evil, of course, but also, at least initially, Claude Opus is already a very expensive model. The tokens are very expensive. And Mythos is something like 5 times more expensive than Claude Opus. So it's a very, even for if you're in the private preview here, it's extremely expensive to run. Now, some of those attack groups are very well funded, especially the nation state ones. Like they can get the money, but it's not like a script kiddie is going to be able to just start firing this off against open source libraries everywhere. That's the good news. You're going to have to be motivated to want to find them and exploit them and have the funding to do so, at least initially. Now, as we also know, tokens have more than followed Moore's law in becoming more inexpensive over time. Your dollars per token has exploded compared to where we first started and how much this stuff costs to run. And that's where people are like, oh, you burned down 2 trees and used up a swimming pool of water to run your prompt. Like, no, that's complete fantasy today. That's not how this stuff works. It's way more efficient than that. But also the state of the art, is still much less efficient at first. So things like this model are much less efficient. And yeah, maybe you did cut down a tree by telling it to find a different vulnerability. More to come here, of course. I get what they're trying to do. I provided some context, not to be skeptical, but just to paint the complete picture here for our listeners. Our business is changing, right? And I think that's interesting. And hopefully we get to a day where the good news is a lot of the software we rely on in the world is still very well resourced, and the companies behind it are very well resourced. And so if they can get access to these frontier models first and they can afford to run them comprehensively against their code base, then we can have more secure code before it ever ships. It just becomes something you do, like fuzzing or anything else, where before this goes out the door, we run this as part of our security review. And that would be a great world to live in. And a world where these tokens become eventually so commoditized that it's trivial to just be like, run this against every repo in GitHub, and just go automatically notify every repo owner of all the vulnerabilities you find. Like, wouldn't that be amazing if GitHub just did that by default? Now, I mean, that's a long way off because, by the way, GitHub is having like exponential growth in terms of the number of repos on there. So the ability to give that away is not coming anytime soon. And GitHub is, of course, a Microsoft company, although they're operated completely autonomously from Microsoft. So I have no knowledge or anything about their business. I do know it's growing like crazy. I'm just dreaming that someday these things will be so commoditized to the point where an AI-driven security review is just comes with it. It's just built in. And that will happen. Will it happen in 5 years, 10 years? That's the part that's hard to predict. But ultimately think we can bend the curve to the good guys in the long run here, but short term we may have some pain that we have to work through. And I think especially, and we've had open sources popped up in cybersecurity news a lot. We've talked about a lot of open source libraries on the show a lot, Andy, recently. I think that's the area where this is the scariest. I think that's the area where this gets worse first. I think closed source software will actually be in better shape, like in a post Mythos world. Open source software would be what I'm most scared about in the very near term. But that's just me trying to predict the future, and I am certainly not good at it, because if I was, I would have won the lottery or invested in the right companies or something else. But
Yeah, I think
that's how I see it.
like also, with this project Glasswing, they're giving permission to these companies because they're not only going to be scanning first party stuff, but obviously there's a lot of libraries and all that you might be using open source stuff on as well. And so these companies like Microsoft, for example, we use open source software.
Yes.
And we use some libraries that, are open source. We have access to this, and I'm sure they're going to be scanning those, right?
I agree. Yes.
So, out of the top used open source, software in these 40 some country or organizations, there's going to be a lot of open source stuff that's going to get scanned as part of this.
A lot of pull requests coming all of a sudden.
Yeah. So
yeah, that's a good point. That actually does give me a little bit of relief here. I mean, CrowdStrike's on the list, Google's on the list, Linux Foundation, of course. I mean, they're going to be scanning all the libraries they're calling as part of their software, as part of their, and those organizations are going to be more buttoned up and knowing what is their bill of materials, what are all the libraries they're dependent on, what are their dependencies. That is encouraging as well. And to your point as well, Microsoft kind of has a unique place in this because, and you mentioned this, not only are we using Mythos for our own security research, but also we are one of the implementers. We're one of the ways people get access to it. So for example, you list off a bunch of companies, and I'm just going to guess, like, let's say JP Morgan Chase, maybe they're primarily in Azure. I don't know if they are. I'm just making stuff up. If they need access to Mythos, they can do that through Microsoft Foundry on Azure to build their Mythos-based agents. They want to do things and gain access to it as well. So it's not just we're using it for internal purposes, but we are also one of those that are helping distribute this to the world, which is pretty cool.
Yep. Very cool. All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information as well as the links that we used for our show will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just email us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.